There's no denying that John Lennon is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. His work with the Beatles in albums like Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and Abbey Road cemented him as a creative powerhouse. And since he was the one who got a divorce from the Beatles, fans believed that he was about to conquer the world of music with back-to-back masterpieces. However, for many, he didn't even come close to that. Actually, some fans have a hard time believing this is the same John Lennon that changed the world of music in the 60s. But is it really that bad? If you were to dive headfirst into his solo discography, would you really be disappointed? Or will you find a massive amount of incredible songs that prove that he was always an amazing songwriter?
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
Talking about John Lennon is never going to be easy. I get really confused every time that I have to talk about his discography, mainly because he has so many good albums but also so many bad ones that I don't know if he's one of the greatest songwriters of all time or a complete disappointment after he left the Beatles. Sometimes I start recording and I think the video is going to be positive. I'm going to say a bunch of nice things about his music, but then I end up complaining about the poor quality of some of the albums he released in the mid-60s and late 60s. And a lot of people comment on these videos saying, are you really a fan or do you not like John Lennon's solo discography at all? And honestly, I don't even know if I can answer that question truthfully because sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it, so I thought it would be a nice idea for a video if I go through every single album in a chronological order and give my opinion on every single one of his albums, talk about some of the context in which the albums were released, and then you guys can do the same in the comments section. Before we get into it though, I feel like I must remind you guys that John Lennon is one of my favorite artists of all time. His work with the Beatles has some of the most amazing pieces of music I ever heard, and everything negative that I'm going to say in this video, I say it mainly because the contrast between the good albums and the bad albums is so big, is so noticeable that I can't help but be disappointed and sometimes be a little agitated. But I love John Lennon. Don't think that I'm dissing the guy or anything, I'm just talking about music here. So if you disagree with anything I say, once again, instead of getting offended, leave a comment down below so we can have a conversation. I can give you my opinion on your opinion and you can do the same thing. With that being said, let's go with the Unfinished Music Trilogy. I was really excited about making this video, mainly because it gave me an excuse to go back to this man's discography, and I'll take it. But it also means I have to listen to the Unfinished Music Trilogy again, and I hate these albums with a passion. I've made quite a few videos on these albums recently. I don't know why I put myself through the pain of listening to Yoko Ono vocalizing for about 30 minutes or an hour. But I do it because I think it's really interesting that John Lennon, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, decided to do such a terrible piece of music. I think it's fascinating, mind-blowing actually. Part 1 of this Unfinished Music Trilogy is Two Virgins, an album where John Lennon basically records himself cheating on his wife, and I'm not exaggerating. As the story goes, John Lennon's marriage was basically over. Cynthia went on holiday to Greece with her friends, and while she was on holiday, John Lennon called Yoko Ono up. She showed up, and they recorded this album, and then they had sex, and that is Two Virgins. Actually, the original album cover that for obvious reasons I'm not going to be putting on this video features the two of them naked looking at the camera. You can see her balloons, you can see her cooch, you can see John Lennon's penis, and if you wanted to see some ass, you can also do it if you look at the back side of the record. This album is technically a piece of avant-garde music, which basically means the music follows no certain structure. It's a fully experimental album where Yoko Ono vocalizes for about 24 minutes, and then John Lennon is playing like piano chords, tapes, guitar strings in the background. It's a really eerie album. It can be a little disturbing, so if you're into that kind of vibe, maybe you'll enjoy this album a little more than the vast majority of the humans in this planet. But the thing is that even if you think that this eerie aura the album has is interesting, it wears off after 8 or 9 minutes of Yoko Ono screaming. It's not interesting anymore because it doesn't really go anywhere. A lot of people like to say that Yoko is like this genius of vocalizing because of the way she uses her voice, and I do believe that she was influential to a point, but overall I think that her style of performance is one of the laziest I've ever seen because it doesn't change. It doesn't really go anywhere. She screams and screams and screams and doesn't really do anything after the screaming. It doesn't lead up to anything. The same type of vocalizing you get in minute 1 is the one you're going to get in minute 24, which makes the album a really unrewarding experience, which is the reason why, in my opinion, even though this is the most acceptable album out of the trilogy, it's still a terrible piece of music. But they didn't really stop there because 1969 rolled in and they decided to make another avant-garde album, this time a little longer, with a live performance included in it. Life with the Lions, the Unfinished Music Part 2, is a little more interesting than the first one. Not better, I don't think it's enjoyable at all, but I do think it's a little more interesting because of the lore behind it. Basically, this whole, the second half of this album is Yoko Ono having a miscarriage and, kind of trying to tell the story through conceptual pieces of music or recordings. I don't really know how to explain it. You have songs like No Bed for Beatle John, where she tells the story of how John had to sleep in the floor because they needed to use the bed for another patient. Then you have the song 2 Minutes of Silence and Baby's Heartbeat, basically representing the death of, or the miscarriage of the baby. And then you have Radio Play, which is Yoko Ono and John Lennon reading things from the newspaper. 12 minutes of that alone, there's barely any music played throughout the entirety of this album. You do have that live performance, the first track, the first side of this album, Cambridge, 1969. Once again, Yoko Ono vocalizing for about 28 minutes. I don't really remember how long the track was, but it doesn't really matter. It's a very pointless, boring, and bland, uninspired piece of music, if you want to call it that way. And then the rest is the story I told you. The first time you listen to this album, it's really interesting because, going from that transition from the Baby's Heartbeat to 2 Minutes of Silence can be a little disturbing, and it can really make you feel something, which is the whole point of music or an album. But on subsequent listens, it loses a lot of its power, which is the reason why, once again, I think this is one of the most horrible pieces of music released in 1969. But, at least they try to make it somewhat musical. At least they try to add some sounds, some chords, some melodies here and there in those two previous albums. But when it comes to the wedding album, the third part of the Unfinished Music Trilogy, you really don't have anything even close to music. It sounds like a YouTube video, but it's only the audio. A really terrible and disturbing YouTube video, by the way. The wedding album is one of the most insulting and disrespectful musical statements ever made. Not because of anything that's said in the album. It's just the fact that John Lennon and Yoko Ono really thought they could call this an album. The first side of this album is called John and Yoko. It's basically a recording of them calling each other's name in ways that go from sexual to aggressive to intense to sad to happy to weird. Honestly, I remember when I heard it for the first time, I was embarrassed because my sister was in the living room and she thought I was doing something else. She didn't think I was listening to music. Imagine listening to that for 22 minutes, and it gets worse. I can't show you the worst parts of this recording because the video is probably going to get demonetized. It's horrible. How can you even call that music? There's not a single chord played in this entire thing. There's not a single melody. They don't even sing. They're just calling each other's name. How is that music? But it gets better on the second half of this album, Amsterdam. That's a pretty name, so surely this is a better piece of music. Well, once again, it's not even music. Amsterdam is basically a recording of their bed piece movement in March or May of 1969, I don't really remember, but yeah, it's not really, it's more like an interview, a bunch of reporters asking them questions about really serious and like important societal issues and them answering in the most ridiculous and childish ways possible. Alright, so we're done with the Unfinished Music Trilogy. We're about to get into the good stuff, but before we do that, I want to remind you about the duality of John Lennon, because at the same time that this man was releasing some of the worst pieces of music of all time, he was writing and making and recording the songs for the Let It Be album, the Abbey Road album, and the White album. So let that sink in for a minute. I think it's safe to say that the late 60s and the early 70s were a really tough time for John Lennon. He was going through a lot of things, the breakup of the Beatles, the fact that everyone hated the woman he decided to marry, and all the controversies he was involved with because of his political ideology. So no one really was expecting the most focused and cohesive piece of music ever. But they were wrong, because Plastic Ono Band is, in my opinion, one of the greatest albums of all time and the best thing to ever come out of the solo discography of any Beatle. I know a lot of people are going to come and complain, talk about All Things Must Pass, Been on the Run, Ram, but in my opinion, there's no album with such levels of honesty and raw emotion as Plastic Ono Band in the history of music. If you were to take every album ever released and you were to rank them based on how emotional and vulnerable, I think this album would be at the very top of that ranking. This album was pretty much a happy accident when you look at at the elements that built this album, they're not all that great. You have very simple instrumentation, echoed vocals that kind of ruin the performance a little bit, the dry drumming, low production value. This album was not meant to be the masterpiece it is, but it somehow manages to connect all of those dots and make an experience that I haven't been able to replicate in any other album I've ever listened to. Mainly because I think all the imperfection this album offers, it's part of what makes it such a great piece of music. We finally see John Lennon at its most personal and intimate. We already saw that before, like little preludes of it in songs like Julia, songs like Your Blues and I'm So Tired, and even in Let It Be with songs like Across the Universe. But we never really saw the finished product. John Lennon dealing with his inner demons and in the process building this disturbing but honest aura that surrounds this entire project. I cannot explain to you how disturbed I was the first time I listened to Mother for the first time, with the church bells, with John Lennon screaming, with his passionate performance. Then you go to songs like Well, 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 and I Found Out, where he literally screams his way through the tracks, crushing his throat and still managing to deliver an amazing performance. The poetry of God, the beauty and tenderness of songs like Hold On, Look at Me, Love. This is the perfect example of how lyrics and emotion can save an album, even if it doesn't have great production value or instrumentation. It's just good because it's emotional. And even though it's a little sad that we never really got to see this version of John again, I think it makes perfect sense because you cannot make an album like Plastic Ono Band twice. It's impossible. But honestly, I don't think he needed to, because even though 1971's Imagine is not a better album than Plastic Ono Band by any means, I do believe it's way more enjoyable. This album features what in my opinion is the most solid track list out of his entire discography. You have the title track, one of the most popular and recognizable songs of all time, A Hymn for Peace, and one of the most iconic songs ever made. You have Crippled Inside, a really enjoyable rock and roll tune, Jealous Guy that uses the choir and Phil Spector's trademark production really well. I think that Phil Spector knew how to work with John Lennon way more than he knew how to work with George Harrison, and his arrangements helped John's voice sound a little nicer and a little more pretty, which is something that made John Lennon very insecure at the time. John Lennon was never too happy with his own performance, and Phil Spector adding all these overdubbing and all these extra production details helped John build one of his most beautiful songs of all time, How and Oh My Love. I do believe that some moments in this album are a little too syrupy. Once again, I think that Phil Spector has a lot to do with that. For example, the song Oh Yoko, I believe that the piano chords and the guitar playing in that song is way too shiny and way too uplifting when that doesn't really match John Lennon's energy at all. I do believe that something similar happens with the song I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama, because the song goes on for way too long and the instrumentation doesn't really do a good job maintaining the interesting or the listener's attention through the entirety of the 6 minutes. You do have that wonderful song How Do You Sleep in this album, the total annihilation of Paul McCartney's character, the first diss track ever made, an incredible guitar performance by George Harrison, even better vocals by John Lennon, and a really good string arrangement arranged by Phil Spector, I believe. There's a lot to like in this album, and honestly, I feel like if I didn't know John Lennon's life all that much, if I didn't know the context in which a Plastic Ono Band was released, this would be my favorite album, definitely. This is where it gets ugly for John Lennon, because after releasing two of the greatest albums of all time, people were obviously excited to see what he had next. January of 1972, he announces the album and he releases the album sometime in New York City with some of his worst and most controversial songs of all time. John Sinclair, The Luck of the Irish, maybe Attica State could be ruled out as an exception because they are songs that I do enjoy quite a bit, but when it comes to songs like New York City, when it comes to Woman is the N-word of the world, that's literally the name. I'm not going to repeat it for obvious reasons. And when you look at the Yoko Ono compositions here, Sister Oh Sister, Angela, and World Water, with those stupid, weird parallels and comparisons she made with politicians and figures of importance back then, it has some of the most stupid and ignorant lyrics I've ever seen in my life. And that's only when it comes to the studio version of the album, because when you go to the live version, you have Yoko Ono doing her thing. Upon release, Sometime in New York City was one of the most disappointing albums of all time, and obviously the fact that John Lennon said the N-word wasn't as controversial back in 1970 as it would be now, but it's still a really questionable decision for a song title, even if he meant well. I understand the message, I understand what he's trying to say, but that doesn't mean that you can just use the word that was used to enslave people back then. However, in comes 1973's Mind Games, another New Year's Day release, by the way. This album is definitely better than Sometime in New York City. I believe that it features some really good songs, some of my favorite actually, like Only People, I Know, Mind Games, Tight Ass. I know that song is a little bland and a little silly, but I don't know, I just like the melody. And of course, Intuition, which is my personal favorite out of this entire album. The instrumentation in this album is way softer than the one we saw in Sometime in New York City and Plastic Ono Band. Not as sharp, not as dry, very similar to Imagine. So I'm pretty sure that if you liked Imagine, and most people do, you'll enjoy a fair share of this album too. The main issue with this album, and the reason why I don't see anyone comparing this album to Imagine or Plastic Ono Band, is mainly because there's a lot of forgettable songs in here, and the highs of this album are not as high as the one we saw in those early records. You do have the title track, you do have Intuition once again, but the only reason why those songs are good is because they have a nice melody and some really nice instrumentation to go with it. There's no moment in this album where you feel like you're listening to something that belongs to the Hall of Fame of music, and the fact that this album was released at a really troublesome time in John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono. Actually, right after this album, he went to his Lost Weekend thing where he spent 18 months apart from Yoko Ono and was in a brief relationship with May Pang. I don't know if the timelines match, but I believe that a lot of those troublesome times he was going through at the time had a lot to do with the record being so low energy and so unfocused. Once again, not a bad album, but you couldn't really call this some of his best work. In my opinion, a little bit disappointing when I heard it for the first time. But that was about to change, because 1974, another New Year's Day release, brought what in my opinion was his best album since Imagine, Walls and Bridges. The first time I heard this album, I thought it was on the same level of quality as Mind Games, the same level of energy too, similar songwriting, similar instrumentation, but honestly, I was so wrong. He offers so much more energy and passion and excitement at the time of performing a lot of these songs, like Whatever Gets You Through the Night, What You Got. His vocals on that song are amazing, but I believe that the more seductive and pretty and kind of, flirting with the psychedelic moments in this album are the highlights. For example, the track Dream Number 9. That song is, in my opinion, the best thing he ever did after Strawberry Fields Forever and A Day in the Life, and I'm not kidding. I love this song with passion. I believe it's one of the greatest songs of 1974. The psychedelic elements, the beauty of his vocals, the echo, the shiny, sparkling sounds in the background, that sound like glitter, like the literal auditive manifestation of glitter. It sounds beautiful. It's a beautiful song, and it elevates this album to new heights, in my opinion. But that's not it, really. The seductive nature of the chord play in Bless You, the wonderful Going Down on Love, the Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, even though that track is a little syrupy, I really do enjoy it a lot. This album is really good, and every time that I listen to it again, it grows on me a little more, to the point where even though I made a ranking of his entire discography, I think 3 months ago on this channel, if I had to do that ranking again, I would probably put this album above Double Fantasy. That's how much it's grown on me in only a couple of months. I do believe there's a little bit of filler in this album. I don't really think this album needed to be 46 minutes long, like Yaya, like Beef Jerky, Old Dirt Road, songs that were quite unnecessary. Maybe a 28 minute album would have been a lot better, and would have, honestly, if you only include the highlights, I think this album would be on par with Imagine. But because that's not the case, because the album is almost 15 minutes long, I have to say that it was a little disappointing to see those filler tracks kind of sneak into the track list. But for the vast majority of the songs in this album, John Lennon delivers some of his best songwriting ever since his Imagine days. Unfortunately, inconsistency is something that plagues John Lennon's solo discography, because in 1975, after releasing some of his best songwriting in Walls and Bridges, he comes up with a covers album called Rock and Roll. The story of this album is fascinating. It was released in February of 1975, but it was recorded originally in October of 1973. The sessions were led by Phil Spector, inspector. He disappeared with the tapes and was involved in a car accident. The tapes were damaged beyond recovering, so John Lennon decided to focus on the Walls and Bridges album, and then after that, in October of 1974, he recorded the songs for the rock and roll album. I want to make something clear though. Me saying that this album represents John Lennon's inconsistency doesn't really mean this is a bad album. That's not what I'm trying to say. I do enjoy a vast majority of this record. Bebopalula, Stand By Me, Ain't That a Shame, Do You Want to Dance, Slipping and Sliding, Bring It On Home. You have some really good songs in here, and his performance is energetic, passionate. You can tell he's having a lot of fun. He even covered the song he got sued over for Come Together, that Chuck Berry song, You Can't Catch Me, which is really funny because the way he sings it, it sounds almost exactly like Come Together. It's fantastic. I do believe that if you like John Lennon's performance style, if you like his voice, if you like his charisma, if you like his personality, a lot of it filters through the songs in this album. So you're going to enjoy this album, but no one really wanted a covers album by one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Really similar to what happened to Paul McCartney when he made Kisses on the Bottom, Run Devil Run. They're not bad albums. You just, we want new music. We want you to come up with something new. And people had the same feeling back in the day in 1975, especially because this album came before a 5-year hiatus. So for 5 years, the only new piece of music that they had from John Lennon were old songs. So obviously people were upset. Once again, it's not really his fault because this wasn't actually meant to be released after Walls and Bridges. It was meant to be released before, and Walls and Bridges was going to be the last album before the hiatus, but that's not how it played out. And because this album is in such an awkward place in his discography, I think that makes it a little disappointing, especially because, it makes a lot more sense for Walls and Bridges to be released in 1975 and this album in 1974. Again, I know that's the way he planned it, but that's not the way it happened, so I can't really comment on something that didn't happen. It's kind of funny because you find some of the best production of his discography in this album. Like, you don't understand how crisp and clean a lot of the instruments sound in this album, but yeah, it's a really good covers album, actually one of my favorites. I do listen to this album quite often every now and then, but I don't really think it's a significant release by John Lennon, so it doesn't really do that much for his solo discography. Now it's time for the final album he ever released while living, November 17th of 1980, Double Fantasy with Yoko Ono. I have a whole video on the channel talking about the wasted potential of this album. You find some of his best songs like Woman, Watching the Wheels, Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy, Just Like Starting Over, one of the most romantic songs ever made, Cleanup Time. The level of songwriting in this album is stellar. The melodic air that he was pursuing ever since the Mind Games album reached its climax in this one, and in the songs in the Milk and Honey album as well, like I Don't Want to Face It, Forgive Me My Little Flower Princess, Grow Old With Me. Those songs really do find John Lennon at the most peaceful and happiest time of his life. And I personally, as a fan, as someone who wanted him to be happy, I feel like that's such an endearing and loving way to say goodbye to him, because we all know what happened after this album was released. But the reason I say this is a wasted potential is because after every John Lennon song, you also have a Yoko Ono song. Now, I will say, she has a few nice compositions in this album. Give Me Something is energetic, and I love the way that her vocals are playful, and she does an attempt to create this back and forth between the instrumental and her voice, and I think it works really well. You also have the song Yes, I'm Your Angel, where she actually tries to sing. I do appreciate that. But, this album for me is like a concept album of their everyday life, talking about the life they always wanted, how they're raising their child, baking bread, living happily ever after with each other. That's what this album is supposed to be. So all the overly sexual and seductive moments in songs like Kiss, 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 or once again Give Me Something, come off as a little weird. I don't really like them all that much. The overly dramatic vocals and instrumentation of the song Beautiful Boys, even though she's not really telling a sad or tragic story, is a little weird too. And her harmonizing with John in songs like Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him and Hard Times Are Over is terrible. Like, their voices don't mix at all. But if you were to replace the Yoko Ono songs by the songs that John Lennon crafted in Milk and Honey, I believe you would have his best solo album ever since Imagine. Like, that's the level of quality we're dealing with in this album. Unfortunately, it is contrasted very heavily by Yoko. I'm not complaining about her, really. I know that she tried her best, and I know that she is a talented songwriter when she wants to, when she's not being a pretentious idiot. As we saw in the album Season of Glass and in some of the tracks that are featured in both of these albums, Milk and Honey and Double incredible fantasy, but overall, she doesn't have the talent to match the level of quality that John Lennon offers on this album, so it brings the quality of the record quite a lot. But I believe that if you were to only focus on John and the songs that he made for these two projects, I believe that you would have a wonderful love letter to the fans, a final goodbye, telling us that he's finally happy at the very end of his life, and that, you know, even though the fact that he was killed is still tragic and it should never be forgotten or forgiven, I believe this was a lovely way for him to subconsciously tell us that even if this whole situation was terrible, and even though we're probably really sad about it still, he was finally living the life he wanted, and he left being a happy man.
I'm talking about the Boy Scouts who aren't allowed to masturbate.
Oh.
It's very tempting when you're wearing shorts. If they only wore long trousers, maybe they'd stand a chance, you know. But I can tell you, you don't go blind, but very short-sighted.
And that is it when it comes to John Lennon. There's a couple more albums we could talk about, like Man Love Avenue and Milk and Honey, but those albums were not approved by John Lennon, so I don't really think of them as part of his solo discography, as part of the canon solo discography. Hopefully, after watching this video, you'll get a better idea on why people are so confused when it comes to John Lennon's solo discography. There's a lot of great music, there's a couple of great albums, but there's also a lot of inconsistency, and there's also a lot of confused albums, you know, that were born more out of a whim rather than an actual musical statement needed to be said. Once again, his work with the Beatles is more than enough to give this man the title of one of the greatest songwriters of all time, but his solo discography also packs some heat, especially when you look at the very beginning and the very end, which is kind of poetic and a little sad too. But if there's one thing to be said about his discography, is that even if you don't like a few albums, even if you don't agree with the way he approached the songwriting in some of these records, you definitely see someone that's growing, someone that's constantly trying to learn from his mistakes. And when you go to the very end, the very last album he ever made, it seemed like he was finally able to take all the mistakes he made in the past and do something better with them, you know, learn from them and make a better life for himself, for his family, and for the fans, delivering some of his most endearing and beautiful, most romantic and just peaceful music he ever did. So even though I have my criticisms, please know that I'm not lying when I say that I'll be forever grateful to John Lennon for delivering such an amazing solo discography. And that'll be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out an album, a song, or an artist, leave it down below as well. I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.